Hello there. Our new topic in U.S. history, 5th period, is crisis and compromise in the United States. Our first subtopic is the issue of slavery. And we wanted you to know that the first serious clashes between the North and the South concerning the issue of slavery occurred in 1819 and 1820. It involved the admittance of the state of Missouri into the Union. In 1819, the United States composed of 11 free states and 10 slave states. And at the time, Alabama was about to be admitted into the Union as the 11th slave state. With this admission of Alabama, the North and South would each have 22 votes in the Senate based on states. When Missouri asked to be admitted to the Union, the balance of votes in the Senate would then shift in the advantage of the South, 24 to 22. Well, it was controversial. So on February 13, 1819, Representative James Tallmadge, which is on your ID sheet, of New York, offered an amendment to Missouri's application to be brought into the Union. And the Tallmadge amendment proposed two things. To, number one, outlaw the further introduction of slaves into Missouri, and number two, to free all children born into slavery in Missouri on their 25th birthday. The House of Representatives adopted the Tallmadge amendment. However, the Senate rejected it. So Congress was now deadlocked. And this deadlock was broken through mutual concessions now known in history as the Missouri Compromise. On the other hand, Maine was petitioning Congress to enter the Union as a free state. So the Senate agreed to combine the admission of Maine and the admission of Missouri, Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. This action would keep the balance of free and slave states even in the Senate. Now, to allow Missouri into the Union as a slave state, slavery was prohibited in the Louisiana Purchase north of latitude 3630. Now, Southern members of Congress accepted the compromise because really cotton could not be grown profitably on land north of this latitude anyway. Well, the Missouri crisis passed and the balance of free states and slave states then became equal. Now, as we've mentioned before, the issue of Texas would be next. Remember, when James K. Polk won the election of 1844, Congress had voted to admit Texas into the Union. Well, Florida entered the Union in 1845, making the balance between the North and South in the Senate in favor of the South by 2 states. Now, this balance was restored by the admission of Iowa in 1846 and Wisconsin in 1848, which were both admitted as free states. So Texas and Florida as slave states, and Iowa and Wisconsin as free states. Our next subtopic is division over Mexican lands acquired in the Mexican War. Now, the new area in the United States that we acquired as a result of the Mexican War became known as the nation's Southwest. Like the Oregon Territory was called the Oregon Territory. The area that we received from Mexico as a result of our victory in the Mexican War became known as the Southwest. Now, there was a distinct division in views Americans had on what should be done with this new land that we acquired from Mexico. And Americans had 4 different positions on what should be done. Number 1, President Polk, along with many American citizens, believed the issue should be settled as a result of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. All lands north of the latitude 3630, which we talked about, should be free of slaves. 2, Democratic Representative David Wilmot, who's on your ID sheet, along with other American citizens, opposed slavery in any of the new lands acquired from Mexico. Remember old John C. Calhoun? He and his supporters insisted that Congress had no right to prohibit slavery in the Southwest. And number 4, Senators Lewis Cass of Michigan and Stephen Douglas of Illinois, both on your ID sheet, argued that the citizens of each territory should decide on whether to permit slavery in their territory or not. That again was the issue of popular sovereignty, which we've talked about. Now that takes us to the election of 1848. And the problem of slavery in the Mexican territories was a hot topic in this election. And both major political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, really refused to take a stand on the issue, fearing that it would tear their parties apart. Now, President Polk refused to run for re-election in 1848, so Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan, who we just mentioned, was the party's nominee. Now, the Whig Party nominated Member General Zachary Taylor for the presidency. He was a general in the Mexican War. He had no political experience. He had little-known political views. Really wasn't a politician. Well, a new political party came into the election of 1848, known as the Free Soil Party, which is also on your ID sheet, whose campaign slogan in this election was, quote, "Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men." The Free Soil Party nominated former President Martin Van Buren for nomination. Now, even though the Free Soil Party failed to carry even one single state in this election, the party did have great influence on its result. Now, the Free Soil Party captured many Democratic votes. In other words, people that would normally vote Democrat voted for the Free Soil Party. And this really hurt Lewis Cass's chances to become president. And as a result, the Whig candidate, Zachary Taylor, who had no political experience, was victorious and became the nation's 12th president. That'll take us to our next subtopic, which is another crisis calling for compromise. California now applied for admission into the Union and wanted to come in as a free state. Now, Southerners who supported slavery refused to consider the application, as the admission of California would disrupt that balance between free and slave states in the Union. And the issue of the Mexican lands that were acquired as a result of our war with Mexico also remained unsettled. Some other issues during this time included, one, Southerners were opposed to a law that would abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, and two, Northerners were opposed to the Southern request for a more effective fugitive slave law, which is on your ID sheet. Now, this new fugitive slave law would require state officials to assist in capturing any runaway slaves that fled from the south to the north. Now, all of these issues were loaded with political dynamite. And any one of the issues that we're talking about here, whether it be California coming in as a free state, or trying to figure out what we're going to do with the lands that we acquired from Mexico, or the issue in the District of Columbia that was supposed to abolish slavery, or the Fugitive Slave Act, any of those issues could lead us to the brink of disunion, if not putting the United States on the brink of war with itself. So we had some issues. Well, the way to solve some of these issues was our next subtopic, which is the Compromise of 1850. Henry Clay again comes upon the scene of American history as the great compromiser. He was very ill and weary from devoted service to the Union, but he stood before the Senate to plead one more time for reason and moderation. Now, Clay's proposal would go down in American history as the Compromise of 1850, and it consisted of the following 5 issues. Number 1, according to his compromise, the admittance of California would happen as a free state. They would be admitted to the Union as a free state. Number 2, the organization of the land that we had acquired from Mexico, except for California, into territories would be based on popular sovereignty, which is on your ID sheet. This is an idea of popular sovereignty we've talked about, where settlers of those specific areas of lands we acquired from Mexico, other than California, would decide for themselves on the issue of slavery. Number 3 of the Compromise of 1850 is a payment of $10 million would be paid to Texas by the United States if Texas abandoned all claims to New Mexico east of the Rio Grande River. The 4th part of the compromise was the abolition or abolishing of buying and selling slaves in the District of Columbia. Okay, so not the abolition of slavery itself, but not allowing the people in the District of Columbia to buy or sell slaves. Okay? It would still be a slave area, but they couldn't buy or sell. And number 5, a more effective fugitive slave law, one that would require state and local officials to help capture and return any runaway slaves that came from the south to the north. Those were the things that Henry Clay stated in his Compromise of 1850. And for more than 6 months, debate ensued on Clay's proposals that we just talked about. As it turned out, most Americans in the North and the South really favored compromise. So in September of 1850, both houses of Congress adopted all of Henry Clay's compromise measures by large majorities. And this compromise once again saved the day for the United States in a time of stress. Again, I want to go over the Compromise of 1850 again. When passed, it, number 1, admitted California into the Union as a free state. Number 2, organized the land acquired from Mexico, except for California, based on popular sovereignty. In other words, the settlers of those areas would decide if they wanted slavery or not. The third part of the compromise, again, was a payment of $10 million to Texas in exchange for Texas abandoning all claims to New Mexico east of the Rio Grande River. The fourth part of the compromise was the abolition of buying and selling slaves in the District of Columbia. Again, this did not abolish slavery, just the ability to buy or sell in that area. And the fifth part of the compromise was a more effective fugitive slave law, one that would require northern officials to help capture and return runaway slaves that left the South and fled to the North. So the Compromise of 1850 again saved the nation from more dispute with itself. After that came up, we had another thing called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is our next subtopic. And in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas, who we mentioned before, wanted federal support for building a transcontinental railroad westward from Chicago to the Pacific Ocean. Now, to achieve this goal, Douglas sponsored a bill through Congress known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what this act would do, if passed, would repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820 by creating 2 new organized territories in the West, the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory. Now, both of these territories were north of that 3630 latitude line that we talked about as proclaimed by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So they were closed to slavery by law. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act would abolish this Missouri Compromise, and the 2 territories were now free to decide on the issue of slavery themselves through popular sovereignty. Now, the passage of the bill was controversial. It split both major political parties in half, and it plunged the nation into a violent controversy over the slavery question. Now, the ink was hardly dry on the Kansas-Nebraska Act before eager pioneers and land speculators from both the North and the South rushed into this new territory. Now, the competition for the best land, the best promising sites for new towns, and the issue of slavery soon led to some bitter disputes. Now, the race really was more for Kansas, especially caused issue when time came to draw up a constitution and try to organize a new territorial government. Now, the crucial question here would be whether Kansas would be a free or slave territory. Again, it was going to be decided by popular sovereignty or by the settlers that went there. Now, what happened is people rushed into Kansas, both people that supported slaves and those that opposed slaves, hoping to get there and populate it at the most height of popularity so that they could decide on their issue of free or slave states. Now, because of these split feelings in the rush into Kansas, by the end of 1855, the territory of Kansas had 2 different constitutions, 2 different governments. One that was pro-slavery and one that was anti-slavery, which obviously is not going to work. Which leads us to our next subtopic, which is Bleeding Kansas. Now, while Congress argued about how to solve the dilemma in the Kansas Territory, violence raged in what people called Bleeding Kansas. Like I said, Northerners and Southerners alike rushed weapons into the territory and violence erupted. Give you two examples. An armed pro-slavery group burned part of the town of Lawrence, Kansas, a center of anti-slavery settlers. In revenge, a fanatical white abolitionist by the name of John Brown, who is on your ID sheet, gathered an armed group, including his own sons, and murdered 5 unarmed pro-slavery men. The fighting over slavery and disputed land claims took the lives of more than 200 men and women in Kansas before federal troops moved in to restore order. Thus the name Bleeding Kansas. That takes us to an election of 1856, and prior to this election another political party was formed, and this new party took its name from Thomas Jefferson's party, and the Republicans re-established themselves in American politics. Now the Whig Party would have a very poor showing in this election, so the two major parties represented in 1856 were actually the Democrats and the Republicans. Now the Democrats nominated James Buchanan, who's on your ID sheet, of Pennsylvania for the presidency, and the Democratic Party supported the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Republicans countered with John C. Fremont, who we talked about in the Mexican War, and they ran under the campaign slogan of free soil, free speech, free men, and Fremont. Almost all of Fremont's support came from the North, and as a result, Buchanan won the election with 174 electoral votes compared to 114 for Fremont. So, James Buchanan becomes the nation's president. That takes us to another slavery issue called the Dred Scott decision. And on March 6, 1857, the Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott decision. Now, Dred Scott was a slave who wanted to prove in court that he was a free man because his owner had taken him from a slave state, Missouri, into a free territory, the Wisconsin Territory. Now, one lower court decided for Scott, another lower court ruled against him. As a result, this ended up in the Supreme Court, and when the Supreme Court ruled, they stated that residents in a free territory and or a free state had not given Dred Scott his right to freedom. And this decision meant that all slaves were not a citizen of the United States, therefore Scott had no right to sue in either state or federal court. Now this takes us to an important subtopic, which is the emergence of Abraham Lincoln. Now, the contest for the office of United States Senator from Illinois in 1858 turned out to be a prelude of the upcoming presidential election of 1860. Senator Stephen Douglas, the incumbent and a strong politician, would be running for re-election to the Senate from Illinois as a Democrat in 1858. To oppose Douglas, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln, a little-known politician at that time in history. Lincoln was born in Kentucky, grew up poor, received no formal schooling as a young child, and moved to Illinois at the age of 21. Abraham Lincoln actually joined the Whig Party soon after his move to Illinois and was elected to the state legislature there in his early 20s. In 1846, Abraham Lincoln was elected to the House of Representatives from Illinois. He served one term, and during this important Senate race, Lincoln boldly and immediately challenged the polished Douglas to a series of debates. Now, Douglas was known as the best debater of the times, and many people saw Lincoln as a very foolish person for challenging such a powerful man in Douglas. Now, Douglas, as you might expect, eagerly accepted Lincoln's offer, and 7 debates were scheduled from August to September 1858. And these debates would feature 2 men of completely opposite characteristics. You had Douglas, a well-groomed and polished man. He had a stocky figure and a very bullish voice, against Lincoln, who was lanky, tall, had baggy clothing, unshined shoes, and a high-pitched voice. Now, after the debates were completed, Douglas went on to defeat Lincoln and was re-elected to the Senate. However, Lincoln's loss in this election was a little bit of a victory for him because he established himself with his courage to challenge the seasoned Douglas, and his showing in the election actually would pave his way for a successful bid for the presidency in the election of 1860. These debates obviously went down in history as the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and we actually have that style of debate even in our speech and debate program here at Worland High School. Our next subtopic is not one of a positive nature. It's John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And in October of 1859, John Brown, the man that had the issue in the Nebraska and Kansas territory, made a tragic contribution to the issue of slavery in the United States. Brown was an abolitionist. He gathered a group of 18 followers and put together a four-part strategy. Number one, he was going to stage an attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Federal arsenals where the federal government keeps their weapons and ammunition. Number two, he was going to arm the slaves that he believed would flock to his side after he attacked the arsenal. Number three, then was going to establish a black government in the mountains of Virginia. And number four, he was going to train those blacks and his own followers to wage a private war against the South. He was that strong, or maybe crazy, in his feelings about anti-slavery. Now, Brown began his plan by attacking the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, but no blacks joined in his efforts. Instead, Brown and his men were met by United States Army troops under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. Yes, the same man that will command the South in the upcoming Civil War, who at this time was a member of the Northern Army. It wasn't even the Northern Army, it was the Union Army. Now, Colonel Lee and his men trapped Brown in a railroad house near the arsenal, and after a 2-day ordeal in which 10 of Brown's men were killed, John Brown then surrendered to Colonel Lee. Brown was later tried and convicted of treason against the United States and was hanged by Virginia authorities. That'll take us to the important election of 1860. Now, when the Democratic Party met to choose a presidential candidate, they were split on the issue of slavery, which caused some philosophical differences and really hurt the party. Southern Democrats obviously were very strong in their pro-slavery position. Northern Democrats took the position that popular sovereignty should decide the issue of slavery, where the people of the state or territory would make that decision. As a result, their feelings were so far apart in the Democratic Party, they actually chose 2 candidates for president, which is going to hurt them in this election. The Southern Democrats nominated Vice President John C. Breckinridge, who's on your ID sheet, for the presidency. And the Northern Democrats countered with Stephen Douglas, Senator of Illinois. Now, the Republican Party met, and they were discussing 2 possible men to nominate for the presidency: Abraham Lincoln and Governor William Seward of New York, who's on your ID sheet. The delegates for the Republican Party had a very difficult time choosing between either Lincoln or Seward, and it actually took 4 separate ballots to decide between the 2 men. On the first ballot, Seward had more delegate votes than Lincoln, but he didn't have the 2/3 majority you needed to be nominated. On the second ballot, Seward and Lincoln were almost dead even. On the third ballot, Lincoln won the delegate votes, but he was 2 votes short of the 2/3 majority needed. And finally, in the fourth ballot, Lincoln received the necessary 2/3 of the delegate votes to earn the nomination. So it's going to be, at this point, Abraham Lincoln for the Republicans. The Democrats are going to have 2, John C. Breckinridge and Stephen Douglas. Well, a third political party jumps into the election of 1860 when the former Whig Party formed the Constitutional Union Party, which is on your ID sheet, and they nominated Senator John Bell of Tennessee for the presidency. So you have a very crowded field in this election. Now, it was pretty apparent that the most electoral votes would be in the northern states. That's where the most population was. And the candidate that could win the majority of the northern states in this election would be winning the presidency. Well, Senator Bell won 3 states, Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Vice President Breckinridge won the rest of the South. Senator Stephen Douglas only carried 2 northern states, Missouri and New Jersey. And then Abraham Lincoln carried the rest of the important North, winning 180 electoral votes to be named the nation's 16th president. So the split in the Democratic Party really aided Lincoln in his efforts. We now work towards a new subtopic, drifting toward war. The South begins to secede. Now, when a state secedes from the Union, they basically state that they don't want to be part of the Union anymore, which is not a good situation. Well, on December 20th, 1860, the state of South Carolina became the first state in the South to secede from the Union. By February 1st of 1861, all the states in the Deep South followed suit, which included Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. On February 8th of 1861, a temporary government was established at Montgomery, Alabama, and the name of the new government was the Confederate States of America, which took 3 important steps after establishing itself. Number 1, they chose a president, Jefferson Davis, on your ID sheet. Number 2, they seized all federal arsenals and federal property that were located in the South that belonged to the Union. And number 3, they sent Southern diplomats to both England and France to negotiate both financial and military assistance. So they turned to foreign countries, the South did, to help them against the North. Now, 4 Southern states did not leave the Union at this time, but they stated they would leave the Union, they would secede, if the Union used any force against the states that did secede. And the 4 Southern states that chose not to leave the Union at this point were Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas. Now, excuse me, the entire problem of secession would be inherited by President-elect Lincoln, as President Buchanan really did little about the situation. Finally, Inauguration Day arrived and Abraham Lincoln was sworn into office as President of the United States, and during his inaugural address, he made 2 things very clear. 1, secession from the Union was illegal, and 2, federal property in the South, in other words, property that belonged to the Union in the South, would be held by the federal government and protected. Excuse me. Finally, we move to the last subtopic, which is the fall of Fort Sumter, which really led us to Civil War. After Lincoln took office, he knew that much of the federal property in the South had already been taken during the latter stages of the Buchanan administration. Nothing he could do. And he stated clearly that the Union would not try to regain this property that was lost before he became president. But he did make it clear, President Lincoln, that there would be 2 Southern Union military posts that would be protected at all costs. Fort Pickens, which is on your ID sheet, that's located in Florida, and Fort Sumner, which is located in South Carolina. Now, President Lincoln ordered U.S. Navy ships to Fort Sumner with supplies. When the Confederates heard of this news, they immediately attacked the fort before supplies had a chance to arrive. So on April 12, 1861, at 4 o'clock a.m. in the morning, the rebels from the South opened fire at Fort Sumter. Now, Union Major Robert Anderson, who's on your ID sheet, did the best he could and held out against Confederate attack for 36 hours. And finally, he could not hold out any longer, and he surrendered Fort Sumter to the South and marched his men out. Ironically, in this assault, no one on either side were killed in the cannon fight. However, it would be the last battle of the Civil War that would result in no casualties. When President Lincoln received news of this surrender, he acted quickly, asking for 75,000 volunteers to enlist in the United States Army to fight against the Confederate States of America. So many men volunteered, thousands were turned away. Now, once Lincoln had the necessary troops to fight against the South, he asked Congress for a formal declaration of war. And Congress complied with his request, and war was declared by the Union upon the South, or the Confederate States of America. As soon as word of war declaration was heard publicly, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and part of Virginia seceded for the Union. The western part of Virginia, as we know as West Virginia now, opposed secession and split out to form the new state, West Virginia. At this time, the Confederate States of America stood at 11 strong. The capital city was moved to Richmond, Virginia, and the Civil War had begun in the United States.